The fearsome warriors of ancient Britain. Through the dense morning fog of ancient Britain, the Roman sentinels caught their first glimpse of what they would later describe in trembling dispatches as demons made flesh. These were no ordinary barbarians charging from the mists. Their bodies were adorned with intricate swirls of blue woad dye, their hair stiffened with lime into spikes that seemed to pierce the very heavens, and their battle cries, amplified by massive bronze horns called carnyxes, shattered the dawn with inhuman shrieks. The empire that had conquered 3 continents found itself facing an enemy that turned terror itself into an art form. The story of how Britain's Celtic warriors systematically dismantled Roman military psychology is more than a tale of painted bodies and screaming hordes. It's a masterclass in psychological warfare that would echo through centuries. From Boudica's Chariot generals who transformed the landscape itself into a weapon, to the shadow warriors of Caledonia who made the world's greatest army abandon its dreams of total conquest. This is the story of how an island of tribal societies brought Rome face to face with its deepest fears and forced the empire to build the longest wall in European history just to help its soldiers sleep at night. The Art of Terror, Celtic Warrior Transformation. The transformation of a Celtic warrior began long before the battle. In chambers lit by flickering fires, young warriors learned the sacred art of becoming something beyond human. The application of woad, a blue dye extracted from Isatis tinctoria leaves through a complex fermentation process, was no mere war paint. Roman historian Pliny the Elder documented how Celtic warriors would strip naked and spend hours meticulously covering their bodies in elaborate spirals and animal patterns, each design holding deep spiritual significance. The dye itself stained not just the skin, but seeped into the very pores, creating a permanent marking that declared its wearer a devoted servant of war. But woad was only the beginning. Archaeological evidence from British burial sites reveals bronze mirrors, sophisticated grinding tools, and traces of various mineral pigments, suggesting a warrior culture obsessed with the visual impact of their appearance. They would spend hours washing their hair in lime water, a caustic solution that not only bleached their locks white but made them so stiff they could be sculpted into terrifying shapes. The resulting appearance was described by Julius Caesar himself as beyond anything we had encountered in Gaul or Germania. The psychological effect was calculated with chilling precision. Celtic warriors understood that the human mind, when faced with something that defies its understanding of what is natural, freezes in terror before it can even process the tactical situation. Roman accounts tell of seasoned legionaries who had fought everywhere from the scorching deserts of Africa to the frozen forests of Germania, dropping their shields at the sight of these blue-skinned, spike-haired apparitions emerging from the British mists. As one centurion wrote in his journal, discovered at Vindolanda, "They make themselves into monsters before our eyes, and our training against mortal men proves useless." The ritual of transformation extended beyond mere appearance. Recent archaeological findings at Celtic ritual sites have uncovered evidence of complex warrior initiation ceremonies. Underground chambers, still bearing traces of burnt herbs and etched with spiral patterns matching those found on warrior bodies, suggest that the physical transformation was accompanied by intense spiritual rites. These warriors weren't just decorating themselves, they were undergoing a profound psychological transformation, convincing themselves as much as their enemies that they were becoming something more than human. And perhaps most terrifying of all, these weren't the practices of some fringe cult or elite warrior class. Evidence suggests this transformation was a cornerstone of Celtic warrior culture, with young men and women eagerly anticipating their chance to undergo the ritual. The Romans weren't facing individual warriors. They were facing an entire society that had mastered the art of becoming living nightmares. As the Roman historian Tacitus would later write, "They have learned to make terror itself into a weapon, and in this they have no equals." The carnyx, a fearsome prelude to battle. The sound began as a low drone, rising from the British forests like distant thunder. Roman soldiers stationed at frontier outposts would later describe how the noise would build over hours, a psychological torture that prevented sleep and frayed nerves before battle was even joined. At its heart was the carnyx, a 5-foot-tall bronze war horn crowned with the head of a wild boar, its jaw hinged to clatter and snap with each blast. Archaeological finds at Deskford in Scotland revealed these instruments were engineered with sophisticated acoustic properties, designed to produce frequencies that triggered primal fear responses in the human brain. But the carnyx was merely the foundation of Celtic acoustic warfare. The Roman historian Dio Cassius describes how warriors would attach their scythed chariots with bronze noisemakers that created an otherworldly shriek when in motion. They would time their battle cries, tens of thousands of voices, to coincide with the precise moment when the morning mist began to lift, creating the illusion that the very air was screaming. Polybius writes of how Celtic warriors would break into individual howls and songs, each warrior adding to a cacophony that made it impossible for Roman officers to communicate tactical orders. The final element of this sensory assault was perhaps the most shocking to the Roman psyche: the naked warrior. Celtic nobles would strip bare save for their torques, golden neck rings signifying their rank, and charge into battle wearing nothing but their weapons and blue-woad designs. This wasn't mere barbarism, it was a calculated display of contempt. As one Roman officer wrote in his dispatches, "They show us that they need no armor to face our steel, and in doing so, they make our own armor feel like a prison of fear." Archaeological evidence from battle sites shows how these naked warriors would often form the front ranks, their bodies adorned with the scars of previous battles, each one a testament to their contempt for death. The psychological impact was devastating. Roman military doctrine, built on discipline and formation, crumbled in the face of an enemy that seemed to embrace chaos itself. Written accounts from the frontier describe hardened legionaries becoming physically ill from the combination of visual and auditory assault. The sight of painted, screaming warriors emerging from the mist, backed by the otherworldly howl of the carnyx, would echo in Roman nightmares for generations. As Tacitus would later observe, they defeat us in our minds before they ever reach our lines. The Shadow Wars. Celtic resistance in Britain's forests. The forests of Britain held secrets that Roman military doctrine was never designed to counter. While Mediterranean warfare relied on open fields and organized formations, Celtic warriors transformed their islands' dense woodlands into living weapons. Archaeological evidence from Roman military outposts reveals a pattern of small, daily torments, arrows appearing from nowhere, supply lines mysteriously severed, and sentries vanishing without a trace. Excavated writing tablets from Vindolanda tell of Roman soldiers becoming convinced that the forests themselves were haunted, with one centurion writing, "The trees have eyes, and they belong to painted devils." The British weather, a relentless cycle of rain, fog and bone-chilling cold, became a crucial ally in Celtic guerrilla tactics. Roman armor designed for Mediterranean campaigns would rust and deteriorate in Britain's constant moisture. Their leather sandals, perfectly suited for marching on Roman roads, became death traps in the boggy British soil. Celtic warriors, by contrast, had developed specialized leather boots with cleated soles, examples of which have been found preserved in peat bogs. They could move silently through terrain that left heavily armed legionaries floundering and vulnerable. Dio Cassius records how Celtic tribes mastered the art of the false retreat, leading pursuing Roman forces into carefully prepared ambush zones. They would study Roman patrol patterns for weeks, noting how their rigid military discipline made their movements predictable. Archaeological evidence from battle sites shows how they would manufacture choke points by subtly altering the landscape, felling trees months in advance so new growth would hide the manipulation, or gradually shifting stones to create hidden paths that would bottleneck pursuers into killing zones. The psychological toll was immense. Roman military documents from the period reveal an army struggling with unprecedented rates of desertion. The constant strain of invisible warfare broke hardened veterans. One discovered letter from a Roman soldier to his family reads, "They are shadows that kill. We build walls of stone, but how do you fortify against a nightmare?" The empire that had conquered the known world found itself being systematically dismantled by an enemy they could rarely even see. These shadow tactics weren't just random harassment, they were part of a sophisticated strategy of territorial denial. Celtic tribes would coordinate their attacks across vast distances, using a network of hilltop signal fires so effective that the Romans were forced to build their own parallel system to counter it. Recent archaeological surveys have revealed how these signal points were positioned with remarkable mathematical precision, allowing messages to travel across Britain faster than any Roman messenger could ride. What emerges from the historical record is not a picture of primitive barbarians, but of military innovators who turned their environment, culture, and the very fears of their enemies into weapons of unprecedented psychological effectiveness. As one Roman historian grimly concluded, "In open battle, we can defeat any force in the known world. But in Britain, we are not fighting battles. We are fighting shadows, and shadows do not die." Queens of Terror, Boudica's rebellion against Rome. When Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus ordered the public flogging of Queen Boudica and the assault of her daughters in 60 CE, he made a miscalculation that would cost Rome its most devastating defeat in the West. The Iceni queen's response was swift and devastating. Archaeological evidence from Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester, reveals a systematic destruction so complete that a layer of red ash still visible today marks the moment when Britain's first Roman colony was erased from the earth. The settlement's defenders, facing a woman they had dismissed as a barbarian, found themselves against a military commander of extraordinary tactical brilliance. Boudica's campaign revealed a truth Rome had fatally misunderstood. Celtic women wielded power that transcended gender in ways Mediterranean cultures couldn't comprehend. Queen Cartimandua of the Brigantes commanded an army that could make or break Roman ambitions in Britain. Her political maneuvering, playing Roman interests against tribal loyalties, created a complex web of alliances that even seasoned Roman diplomats struggled to navigate. Recent archaeological findings at her stronghold of Stanwick reveal fortifications that combined Celtic and Roman engineering, suggesting a ruler sophisticated enough to adapt enemy techniques while maintaining cultural independence. The historical record shows these queens weren't anomalies, but part of a cultural tradition where female warriors held positions of significant military authority. Celtic burial sites across Britain reveal women interred with weapons, tactical equipment, and command insignia. The Roman historian Cassius Dio describes female Celtic officers commanding from chariots, their bodies adorned with the same woad designs as their male counterparts, leading troops with a ferocity that shocked Roman sensibilities. A recovered Roman military document from the period reads, "Their women fight with the strength of men, and command with the authority of gods." How do you defeat an enemy that makes no distinction between warrior and woman? This gender-transcendent power structure proved particularly devastating to Roman military psychology. The idea of being defeated by women was so culturally shocking to Roman soldiers that it created a crisis of morale. When Boudica's army of 230,000 warriors descended upon Londinium, the Roman forces, led by men who prided themselves on their masculinity, found themselves retreating from a woman who had transformed personal vengeance into a national uprising. The psychological impact was so severe that Suetonius was forced to abandon the city entirely, an unprecedented admission of Roman vulnerability. The culmination of this female military tradition came at the Battle of Watling Street, where Boudica nearly succeeded in driving Rome from Britain entirely. Though she was ultimately defeated, the battle's aftermath forced Rome to fundamentally reconsider its approach to gender in warfare. As one Roman senator would later write in a private correspondence, "We came to Britain believing we would teach barbarians the meaning of civilization. Instead, their warrior queens taught us the cost of underestimating those we do not understand." Revolutionary British war chariots, Caesar's encounter. Julius Caesar's first encounter with British chariots nearly ended in disaster. What he witnessed wasn't just a mode of transport, it was a revolutionary combat system that would force Rome to rewrite its military doctrine. Unlike the ceremonial chariots of other cultures, British war chariots were lean, agile machines of terror. Archaeological finds at burial sites like Wetwang and Kirkburn reveal sophisticated engineering, lightweight ash-wood construction, carefully balanced iron-rimmed wheels, and innovative pivot points that allowed for turns so tight they seemed to defy physics. The British perfected what military historians now call the carousel of death. Charioteers would approach Roman lines at full speed, then execute a maneuver that seemed suicidal. They would turn their backs to the enemy. But this was precisely the trap. As Roman forces instinctively broke ranks to pursue what they thought was a retreat, the chariot team would demonstrate their mastery. The driver would slam the chariot into a tight turn, while the warrior, standing on the yoke itself, would unleash javelins into the now exposed Roman flanks. Excavated Roman armor from British battlefields shows distinctive puncture patterns that match this tactic exactly. Training for this combat style began in childhood. Recent archaeological surveys of Celtic settlements have revealed practice grounds where young drivers learned to handle chariots at full speed over deliberately treacherous terrain. The relationship between charioteer and warrior required near telepathic coordination. They trained together for years until they could anticipate each other's movements instinctively. Iron Age British coins depict these chariot teams with the same reverence that Roman coins showed their emperors. The effectiveness of British chariot warfare is recorded in Caesar's own words. The enemy, singly, would deliberately gallop their chariots towards our lines. The noise and unfamiliarity of their approach would throw our cavalry into confusion. Having broken through, they would leap down and fight on foot, while their drivers would gradually withdraw from the fighting. Thus, they displayed the mobility of cavalry and the staying power of infantry. But what Caesar couldn't bring himself to admit was how thoroughly this tactic shattered Roman morale. Recovered letters from Roman cavalry officers reveal a deep-seated fear of facing British chariots, with one writing, "They turn warfare itself into a dance of death, and we cannot learn the steps." Found at Wetwang was the burial of a female chariot commander, interred with her vehicle, weapons, and the remains of what analysis suggests were multiple combat wounds, all of which had healed. This wasn't just a ceremonial position. She had survived and continued fighting through injuries that would have ended most military careers. Her burial, dated to around 300 BCE, contained tactical diagrams etched into leather, revealing that British chariot warfare wasn't just practiced, it was continuously refined and theorized, producing innovations that would influence cavalry tactics for centuries to come. The ritual of war, sacred groves, and spiritual warfare. In the cold light of dawn, Roman scouts would sometimes stumble upon scenes that defied their comprehension. Sacred groves where severed heads hung from oak branches, each one positioned to face north, according to precise ritual requirements. These weren't random acts of barbarism. They were part of an intricate spiritual warfare that merged combat with cosmic significance. Archaeological evidence from sites like Ribemont-sur-Ancre reveals carefully constructed temples built from the bones of defeated enemies, arranged in patterns that aligned with celestial movements. The Celtic head cult transformed every battle into a sacred harvest. To take an enemy's head was to capture their soul, their strength, and their wisdom. High-status Celtic warriors would keep specialized pouches, examples of which have been found preserved in peat bogs, designed specifically for collecting and preserving the heads of worthy opponents. But this wasn't indiscriminate trophy-taking. Analysis of preserved heads shows careful selection. Only warriors who had fought with particular courage were deemed worthy of this sacred preservation. As Greek historian Diodorus Siculus noted, they preserve the heads of their most distinguished enemies in cedar oil, showing them to visitors with pride and refusing to sell them even for their weight in gold. The Druids, far from being merely priests, were architects of psychological warfare. Their role in combat preparation involved complex ceremonies that modern archaeology is only beginning to understand. Recent excavations have uncovered ritual spaces where warriors would undergo altered states of consciousness through a combination of sensory deprivation, psychoactive plants, and rhythmic chanting. The Roman historian Tacitus describes warriors emerging from these ceremonies in states of battlefield frenzy that seemed to render them impervious to pain or fear. But perhaps most chilling were the prophecy rituals. Classical sources describe Druids performing divination, using the death throes of sacrificial victims, timing battles to astronomical alignments, and conducting elaborate ceremonies to ensure victory. Archaeological evidence from pre-battle ritual sites shows how these ceremonies were carefully staged to be visible to enemy forces, creating a psychological burden before combat even began. One recovered Roman letter reads, "They make death itself into a sacred art, and their priests hold congress with forces our own gods cannot touch." The discovery of the Lindo Man bog body revealed the sophistication of Celtic ritual preparation for war. This high-status individual had undergone a complex series of sacred procedures before his death, including consuming specific ritual meals and receiving precisely placed wounds, suggesting that even human sacrifice was conducted with methodical precision. The psychological impact on Roman forces, witnessing these calculated displays of ritual power, was profound. As one Roman officer wrote, "They have made a sacrament of terror, and their gods seem to delight in it." The Picts, warriors beyond Hadrian's Wall. North of what would become Hadrian's Wall lay the unconquerable, the Picts, whose very name derived from the Latin pictus, painted ones, struck such terror into Roman hearts that an empire spanning 3 continents decided to build the most ambitious barrier in history, rather than face them. Archaeological evidence from the Pictish heartlands reveals a warrior society that had elevated Celtic battle art to unprecedented heights. Their stone carvings depict warriors adorned with animal totems, bulls, wolves, eagles, not just painted on their skin, but sculpted into their very battle formations. The 9th Legion's disappearance into Caledonia became Rome's greatest military mystery. Recent archaeological discoveries suggest they didn't fall in a single catastrophic battle, but were systematically dismantled by Pictish hunting parties using tactics that left barely a trace. Excavations along their presumed route reveal small scattered battle sites, each telling a story of ambush and annihilation. Metal detector surveys have uncovered Roman military equipment deliberately scattered across ritual sites, not as random debris, but arranged in cardinal patterns that suggest the Picts transformed Rome's greatest military disaster into a massive ritual offering. Governor Agricola's campaigns into Pictish territory revealed an enemy that seemed to possess supernatural control over their environment. At the Battle of Mons Graupius, Pictish warriors demonstrated their mastery of highland warfare, using the terrain's acoustic properties to amplify their battle cries. Roman accounts describe how the mountains themselves seemed to scream. Analysis of the battlefield's topography shows how the Picts had chosen ground that would channel sound waves directly into Roman formations, creating a natural amphitheater of terror. The construction of Hadrian's Wall wasn't just a defensive measure. It was an admission of psychological defeat. The wall's architecture reveals as much concern for reassuring its Roman defenders as deterring Pictish raiders. Guard rooms were positioned to ensure no soldier ever had to walk alone. Towers were arranged to guarantee constant visual contact, and religious shrines were incorporated at regular intervals. Physical evidence of an army seeking spiritual protection from the painted warriors of the north. One recovered prayer tablet reads, "Protect us from those who have made darkness itself their ally." But perhaps Rome's greatest miscalculation was assuming the wall would contain Pictish terror. Instead, it became a stage for psychological warfare. Pictish warriors would arrange severed heads along its ramparts in symbolic patterns, coordinate simultaneous attacks at multiple points during astronomically significant dates, and leave ritual objects in places only Roman patrols would find them. The wall didn't stop the Picts. It gave them a canvas on which to paint Roman fears in blood. As one Roman frontier commander wrote in his final dispatch before abandoning his post, "We built a wall to keep the monsters out, only to discover we had built them a monument." The legacy of Celtic psychological warfare. The psychological warfare, perfected by Britain's Celtic warriors, left an indelible mark on military history that echoes through the centuries. When Roman forces finally withdrew from Britain in 410 CE, they left behind more than abandoned forts and crumbling walls. They carried with them lessons in terror that would transform military doctrine. Archaeological evidence from late Roman military sites across Europe shows the adoption of Celtic battle techniques, the use of sound as a weapon, the psychological impact of appearance, and the power of ritual in warfare. The discovery of Roman military training manuals from the 3rd century CE reveals how deeply Celtic tactics had influenced imperial thinking. What began as nightmarish encounters with painted warriors became codified military strategy. Roman units stationed in other frontier provinces began incorporating psychological warfare techniques learned from their British campaigns. A recovered centurion's handbook from Germania shows detailed instructions for using terrain and weather to enhance troop visibility, a direct adaptation of Celtic tactical principles that had once been used against them. As one Roman military theorist wrote in his final treatise, "Our greatest enemies became our finest teachers." The Painted Ones taught us that fear, properly wielded, strikes deeper than any blade. Modern archaeological work continues to uncover evidence of how thoroughly Celtic psychological warfare transformed ancient military thinking. Recent excavations at Roman frontier sites across Europe show the gradual adoption of Celtic-inspired fortification designs, tactical adaptations, and even religious practices aimed at countering psychological warfare. The Painted Warriors of ancient Britain didn't just resist Rome. They fundamentally changed how the ancient world thought about the relationship between terror and power. In doing so, they left a legacy that would influence military strategy for generations to come, proving that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the sword, but the shadow of the hand that wields it.